members and friends of Sh'ma, I greet you all Shalom Aleichem and Shabbat Shalom. On behalf of my congregation, Beth Elohim Hebrew Congregation in Queens, and also of the International Israelite Board of Rabbis, of which I am the president, I greet you again. Shalom Aleichem. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and one that is long overdue, because we have been discussing this and planning it for months and years. And although this may be the first time that many of you are meeting me here today, this isn't a new relationship. I have known many of your leaders and teachers for many years. Prince Sapor has been to Beth Elohim many, many times, and has always been welcomed with love, honor, and respect. And as I look around the congregation, many of you are very familiar to me, of course, and we go back a long time. And of course, Kohen Shiknel, we were Yeladim together. And I'm going to talk about our history and the history of our fathers and the history of our community that go back not only years, but generations, door to door. So I am not coming to you so much as a guest, but as a relative and as a brother who is coming among familiar people. And I was able to tell from the moment I walked into this sanctuary that I am among familiar people, that I recognized and felt a familiar spirit, a common ruach among us that identifies us wherever we are. And so let me begin my subject for today, which I'm going to call the Light of Israel. And for those of you who are familiar with my manner of teaching, and I have been teaching in Israel for a long time, and I've taught many places, even here in New York, as I'm here in Brooklyn. I taught for many years at McGevis College, not too many blocks from here. I've taught at LaGuardia Community College in Queens, and at Long Island University here in Brooklyn. And I'm now teaching at Northampton Community College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And so I want to teach today, as I normally would teach on the Shabbat, on this subject of the light of Israel. Often I begin with Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter. For it is written, Ha'azinu hashumayim va'adabera. Give ear, O heaven, and I will speak, and the earth will hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching fall like rain, my instruction like dew upon the gentle and tender grass. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, hallelujah, and give honor unto our God. This is how I like to begin all of my spiritual lessons at the beginning. That regardless of whether the particular audience I'm speaking to, whether they are receptive to what I am saying, the heavens will give ear. Amen. That I did come, and I did speak the truth, and I did proclaim the name of the Lord and ascribe honor and greatness unto our God. But I do pray that the audience will be like grass, that they will be receptive and soak up like rain, that what I'm saying may nourish them, not just entertain them, but give them some sustenance by which they may grow spiritually in the word of the Most High God. And so what I like to do is to give a little more of that background that I promised and that Chief Benjamin asked me to touch upon today, to talk not only about the scriptural history, which you know very well, but sometimes to talk more about our more recent history, which we often know less of. And that's an ironic thing for our people, that we can know more about things that have happened 3,000 years ago than we know about things that happened yesterday or just a few decades or a few generations ago. So let me step back a little bit and talk about how I've come to be here today and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The rabbis teach us that the Torah has a chain of custody. I use that term. I understand that in the criminal courts, before any information can be entered into court, they have to show the chain of custody of that information. What you are about to present, who had it, and where did it come from? So if there was a gun that was used in a crime, or there was an illegal substance that was supposedly confiscated at the scene of a crime, before they can enter it into court, they have to show the chain of custody. From the time of the crime scene until this day in court, this piece of evidence has been under our control, moved from this place to that place, so that nothing could have been tampered with it from then to now. And so the Torah also has a chain of custody. Okay. We are taught that the Most High gave this Torah to himself, to Moshe. It says, Ba'etzbe Elohim, with the finger of God, he wrote these tablets of covenant. And he gave it to Moses. Moses to Aaron, Aaron to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the judges to the men of the great assembly. And they said three things. Be deliberate in judgment. Rise up many disciples and make a fence around the Torah. This is how the Torah came down through the generations to us. From Moses to this time, to the judges, to the prophets, to the men of the great assembly. And they said, be deliberate, which doesn't mean just be intentional, but to liberate means to debate, to study, to be profound in your understanding of Torah. Be deliberate in judgment. Rise up many disciples, teach and train others to teach. Rise up many disciples that they may teach this Torah to others and make a fence. And this third thing often confuses people. Why make a fence? To protect. That's right. What Hashem has given to us. That's right. To make a fence. The Torah says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, right. But those things that he has revealed belong unto us and to our descendants forever. So there are secret things. Yeah. Not everything is an open book, even in an open book. Right. All right. There are secrets that only the Most High can reveal, that only the Most High can unlock your mind, that you may understand things that have always been there, but that other people cannot see nor understand. Only the Most High can unlock your heart to receive what he wants to give you. So just because you have knowledge of this book, or you have this book in your possession, and every culture in the world has this book. It has been translated into every written language in the world. So they all have it. But only those who God has unlocked their minds and unlocked their hearts can understand and receive what the Most High intends. This is why there are secret things even to this day. This is why you can't just steal this book and have it. This book isn't like the password to your ATM. See, anybody gets that code, they have access to your accounts. They have access to your money. The Torah can't be stolen like that. All right. You could take the book, but the book is only half of what you need. In order for the book to unveil itself, you have to come with the right spirit, with the right heart. Otherwise, it won't work for you. I got the book, I said the same thing as the other person said, but it depends on the person, the spirit that you're bringing with it. And so, talking about this chain of custody, how did this knowledge come down to us in more recent history? Well, we trace that back to Rabbi Arnold Josiah Ford. He's the person on the upper left of your pictures of the great leaders in history. And when you walk by that wall, to know who these people are. Rabbi Arnold Josiah Ford was born April 23rd, 1877. On the island of Barbados. 1877. And he traced his ancestry through an unbroken chain of Levitical ancestry that can be traced from West Africa over the centuries back to ancient Israel. So he is our link. You know, in human evolution, they say the missing link. What is the missing link that connects the ancient with the modern? through him, from Barbados, he said he was able to trace his ancestry from the Caribbean to West Africa, and that his ancestors had traced their ancestry through an unbroken Levitical chain back to ancient Israel. And so he is our link to the transmission of Torah, how it has come down to us through these centuries. He came to America, to New York City, around 1910. Around 1910. Marcus Garvey came to the United States and to New York in 1917, so he was already here. And Marcus Garvey, as many of you know from your larger history, particularly African American history, started an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, otherwise known by its acronym, the UNIA, also in Harlem, New York. Now, the thing to understand about Rabbi Ford is he was already there. He already had knowledge of who he was. These people were not Garveyites, and they didn't regard the movement, as is often described in history books, as the Garvey movement. Okay. They were black nationalists, not followers of Marcus Garvey. He happened to be the leader of the organization, and within the organization, these were people who were trying to teach him about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we know and have records and know other people like Samuel Valentine and Nancy Paris, who are all members and officers of the UNIA. Now, I want to just emphasize that because, again, more people are familiar with Marcus Garvey than they are of Rabbi Ford, the first black rabbi in America. Okay. But within that, they were trying to teach Garvey who he was, to transform his message of political nationalism into one of spiritual nationalism. Right. And to say that we are Israelites. And in their headquarters called Liberty Hall, it's not there today, but where they met, their main headquarters in Harlem, in that building, Rabbi Ford taught Hebrew and held services right there. I said he was an officer. He was the director of the choir, the Universal Negro Improvement Association choir. And usually when you see pictures of Marcus Garvey, it's him in a convertible limousine with his cap and these parades that they would take through the city of Harlem. So music and pageantry was a big part of the music of the organization. All of their meetings would begin with prayer and song, and then Garvey would speak up about different things. So the music was very important. And Rabbi Ford was the director of the UNIA choir and orchestrated many of those great pageants that you see and read about. One of the biggest moments within the UNIA before its decline and collapse occurred in 1920, and this was the Universal Convention. Government started in 1917. 1920, they rented the old Madison Square Garden and packed it. Madison Square Garden. Okay? And at that convention, they had meetings and panels. One was to discuss the future religion of the Negro. This was an open question. What is going to be our future religion? Rabbi Ford was in that meeting, and he was arguing, as they debated this, what should be the future religion of the Negro? And he argued we should return to our original religion, who we are. And they made this argument to Marcus Garvey, tried to influence him, persuade him, and he was receptive to a lot of it, and used a lot of that information in his general just teachings about black nationalism, generally. But he was politically astute enough, perhaps, not to adopt any one particular faith. He also wrote, at that 1920 convention, a couple of things came out of it. One of those things, although they never decided what the future religion of the Negro should be, that he used from Negro Ethiopian is what they used, Ford argued that. What they did decide was that as a nation we each have a flag, and they adopted the red, black, and green flag, which people still see and associate as the black nationalist flag today, the red, black, and green flag. With the flag, you have to have a national anthem. And what was the national anthem called? Ethiopia. Ethiopia was the name of the song. And who wrote the song? Rabbi Ford. Rabbi Ford. So people, again, they recognize the flag, the red, black, and green flag. You ask them what was the name of the anthem, they don't know. What was the name of the song? You tell them it was called Ethiopia. And why did he call it Ethiopia? Again, based on Psalm 68:3, which says, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hand unto God. Ethiopia, so strewn, so forth. Now, what they understood, as I said, with terminology, is even back at the turn of the century, they realized that terms like Negro and colored were not appropriate. And they were looking for an alternative to Negro. And the term that you find used very often during this period is the term Ethiopia. That's why the national anthem is called Ethiopia. When they said Ethiopia, it didn't refer at that time to the country of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is actually a Greek word meaning people of dark face. That's what the word means. And so they referred to it as all of us being Ethiopian people. And this was the term that he most often used, and it became the title of his song and the name of his hymnal, a songbook called the Universal Ethiopian Hymnal. Now, two other things that I'll just mention in relation to Rabbi Ford in this period. When I was doing research on Ford to try to discover this myself, going to various archives, reading everything that had been written on the subject, going through court records and court documents, I discovered a couple of things. One, as I put in the name Rabbi Ford to see if there are any court records, I saw a number of legal cases. One was called Rabbi Ford versus Marcus Garvey. And I was intrigued by this when it came up in my computer search, and all court records of public documents, and so I requested the case, the actual transcripts from the trial and the case that Rabbi Ford, because I knew that they were colleagues, but then I saw they had differences, and that Ford actually took Garvey to court, and what he was suing for was royalties on his song, that he was the author of Ethiopia, and that he was not being paid the royalties that a musician or songwriter is supposed to get on his material, sheet music and records that had been sold. And he had calculated how much sheet music and how many copies of the song Ethiopia had been sold and what he was owed in terms of royalties as a musician. He's a rabbi and a musician. As a musician, he was involved with a number of kind of musical trends through the 1920s called the Harlem Renaissance, and before, a founder of jazz. He played with James Reese Europe, who kind of brought jazz to Europe. Contemporary, for those of you into jazz, of people like Willie the Lion Smith, who's also an Israelite. And so he had this falling out. Furthermore, as you know, when Garvey is arrested and convicted of really bogus charges and then deported, in the build-up to his trial, and some of the records I'm referring to now are available at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. This is in Harlem, and this is where some of these documents are found. Prior to the trial, the FBI agent, in trying to build a case against Marcus Garvey, wanted Rabbi Ford to testify against him, and also wanted particularly other Israelites in the movement to testify against Garvey. So although there were tens of thousands of black nationalists, tens of thousands of Garveyites, when you look within that movement, at the core of the most dedicated, you find that within that core are many Israelites, thousands of followers, thousands of hangers-on, but the core often were people who are Israelites. So again, many people think of Garvey as being the founder of the Back to Africa movement. Back to Africa. He wanted to go to Liberia. Ford argued that we should go to Ethiopia. And so when Garvey is convicted and then deported, he goes first back to Jamaica, then lived the rest of his life in London, never sets foot on the African continent. But with him, he worked not only with Garvey, but with other rabbis and congregations in the early part of the 20th century. One of those was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Mordecai Herman. And you might have seen photographs of Rabbi Herman in front of his congregation in Harlem. Photographs of Rabbi Ford, not that particular one there, but the James Vandersea photographs. James Vandersea was a famous African-American photographer who photographed almost everyone of importance in the early part of the 20th century. And so that James Vandersea photo of Rabbi Ford in front of his congregation on 135th Street called Beth B'nai Avraham is a James Vandersea photograph. The one of Mordecai Herman, his congregation was called the Moorish Zionist Temple. The Moorish Zionist Temple. Now, the Moorish term. Don't confuse the Moorish Zionist temple by Rabbi Mordecai with the Moorish Science temple founded by Noble Drew Ali. But they both use the term Moorish. One was Moorish Science, right? That will then become Noble Drew Ali starts the Moorish Zionist temple, and then W.D. Fard, Elijah Muhammad, and then becomes the Nation of Islam, growing out of the Moorish Science temple, right? They use the term Moors to describe people of North Africa, the Moors, right? Today we call that Morocco in this area. They argue that these were descendants of Ruth, who the Torah tells us is a Moabite. And so they argue that this is who they were through this kind of Moorish ancestry. Rabbi Herman, he called it Moorish Zionist. And this is the beginnings of, at a time when the Zionist movement, the world Zionist movement, is also very active, trying to revive and create the state of Israel. He starts his own congregation called Beth B'nai Avram. Now, a lot of these congregations, most of these congregations I mentioned so far, are no longer in existence. But you have to know that they were there, that they were in existence, congregations in the early part of the 20th century, who they were and how they were related. He started a congregation in 1924, separate from the Garvey movement, called Beth B'nai Avram, which means sons of the children of Abraham. And his congregation flourished until 1930, actually. 1930s, really 1929. October 1929 is the beginning of the Great Depression. Many people have said the economic recession that we are in right now is the worst economic period that this country has gone through since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Well, this economic depression of the 1930s wiped out a lot of these smaller congregations because people lost their jobs, they weren't able to keep their buildings, and many of the congregations went out of business. And so the same thing with Rabbi Ford struggling to stay in existence. And so he decided in 1930 to leave the United States and to try to reestablish in the country of Ethiopia. What inspired him that now was the time to do that? And these are people, again, when you think about them, how heroic and courageous they were. Many of them had left everything they had and owned in the Caribbean to come to the United States, and now in 1930 are leaving everything again to go to Africa, right? So the level of commitment required, right, to sell or leave everything you own and go to someplace else, another country, and start. You go to that country, the United States, and you attempt to build something there for some 20 years and then sell all that and leave and go somewhere else. But he decided 1930 was the time, and reason he thought that this was the time to go to Ethiopia is 1930 was the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. How important was that event in terms of events at the times and what people thought? Well, if you consider the fact that in 1930, on the entire continent of Africa, there were no African leaders in power. Liberia was a country established by the United States to receive freed slaves, which is why the capital of Liberia was called Monrovia after President James Monroe. So it was essentially a colony of the United States, not an independent historic African nation. So if you exclude Liberia as an American-made colony, then there were no independent black countries on the entire continent of Africa. Egypt, of course, was a British colony, right? And so all the nations of Africa had been colonized or colonialized by that time. So in 1930, when Emperor Haile Selassie was going to be proclaimed the ruler of an African nation, black people all over the world saw this perhaps as the fulfillment of Psalm 68, that Ethiopia is stretching out. And this is a new era. And so he, with a group of followers, left the United States and settled in Ethiopia. They actually performed at the coronation of Haile Selassie and was supported by his congregation and his lodge and supporters here in the United States, who includes Robert W. Matthews, I'm just going to talk about in just a moment. While they're there trying to establish a community in Ethiopia, In 1935, he will ordain Rabbi W.A. Matthews, and other historical events would start to overtake them again. So the Great Depression in 1930. In 1935, the beginnings of World War II, which really start with the invasions of African nations like Ethiopia by Mussolini, who invades Ethiopia in 1935. The Japanese invade Manchuria and China, and of course, Hitler invades Poland in 1939 and starting the start of World War II. So these events, these historical events in Africa, Asia, and in Europe, how do they affect our people? So when Ethiopia is invaded in 1935, those black people from the Caribbean and the United States who had gone to Ethiopia to settle, many of them then leave and come back to the United States to the Caribbean, right? And so this is why the community in Ethiopia no longer exists after 1935. Many of them come back. But, and this is the final thing I'll say about Rabbi Ford, before they leave, Nancy Ford and Eudora Ford adopt an Ethiopian child. So they're living there from 1930 to 1935. They're in those 5 years trying to establish a community until the start of World War II, when the country of Ethiopia is invaded by Mussolini and Italy. Before they leave, they adopt an Ethiopian child. And they take that child with them back to the United States. And that child I'm talking about is the elder that we know today as Rabbi Paris, who I understand was here with you last week. Okay. So the history that I'm talking about and the commitment of these people, for those of you who know him but didn't know his history and how he came to be in the United States, you know he's Ethiopian. How did he come to be in the United States? Because Israelites like us who went to Ethiopia and tried to establish a community and adopted children and brought them back to the United States. So he is living history, not just walking encyclopedic knowledge of history, but he is a living example, proof that we were there, if you need other proof. And they came back from Ethiopia and brought Rabbi Paris with him. Rabbi Ford then died in September 16th, 1935. His son, by the way, Professor Avraham Ford, formerly at Howard University, is retired now, and he's moved back to Ethiopia, and he's living in Ethiopia now and continuing to research his father's history with that. But before he died, fortunately, he gave shmicha, which is certificate of ordination, to Rabbi W.A. Matthew. He's the person in the second picture on the top row, second picture, Rabbi W.A. Matthew. Rabbi Matthew was born June 23rd, 1892. So both of these rabbis are 19th century rabbis who lived into the 20th century. He was born in St. Kitts, that time called the British West Indies, now independent country. But all of these were, even Jamaica was at that time still a British colony. So he was from St. Kitts of the British West Indies. And what you see here in terms of our history, that the Israelite community in America was largely established by Israelites from the Caribbean, right? And they brought, both Rabbi Ford and Rabbi Matthews came to the United States and shared this information with black people here in the United States. Hallelujah. And so he was from St. Kitts in the British West Indies. He also claimed unbroken Israelite ancestry, came to the United States, and here I was able to find immigration records and citizenship records for Rabbi Matthews. I know for sure even what day he became an American citizen, but he came to the United States in 1913. And in 1919, and this is an important year, he established what had been the oldest congregation, Israelite congregation, called Commandment Keepers Congregation in 1919. And so, as I talk about these people in these congregations and their histories, this was a very important congregation because it lasted longer than any of the others. So there were a lot of congregations. Some of them were short-lived. All of them were relatively small. But his congregation lasted longer than any other. So, of course, this is year 2000. We were looking forward to 10 years from now celebrating the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the founding of this congregation in 1919. But what I'm pointing out here is that we have been around for over a century. People are always surprised to learn about our existence as if it just happened yesterday. We're talking about we have been, even here in the United States as Israelites, for generations, right? And that our community is approaching a century old here in the United States. So he established commandment keepers in 1919. And in 1931, Rabbi Ford, who dies in 1935, issued him his Shemitah. Shemitah is certificate of ordination. That's what makes you a rabbi. And so what I want you to understand about our evolution, how we evolved. It's one thing coming into the knowledge of who you are in terms of your ancestry. Once you know who you are, how do you be the person you are? And these are the questions that they struggle with. I know who I am in terms of my ancestry, but now that I've returned to that, how do I be who I am? How do I actually observe the laws, commandments, statutes, and judgments that are found in here? This is moving from a knowledge of history to a practice. And this was the difference and the struggle between many Israelites and many Garveyites. Same similar situation between many Israelites and many of our Muslim brothers within the more science and within the Nation of Islam. Many black people were attracted to the historical message of black nationalism. But they didn't want the responsibility and obligations that come with actually being an Israelite.
Exactly.
See, I like the whole message of blackness, but to tell me I can't eat this and I must do that and I have to worship it on these days and I have to observe the Passover and I have to observe Yom Teruah and I have to observe, they don't want all of that. They want the nationalism without the spiritual obligations that come with being an Israelite. And this is what made, there were many, in terms of, you know, when I asked myself and other people asked, if both of these, the knowledge of Israelites and the Nation of Islam were both emerging in America at about the same time, more science, more Zion, all pre-World War I episodes, why did the Israelite community grow so much slower than the Nation of Islam? And I said, well, for them, once you came into the knowledge of who you are, you now have to observe these laws. And people who are just motivated by politics and nationalism, I just want to deal with America and deal with racism and deal with, I don't want to deal with unleavened bread. I don't want to be told every time I eat or everything. I just want to deal with the politics. And this is why you could, you know, this is the difference between just joining a purely political organization and being an Israelite. So much of what we do has nothing to do with necessary contemporary politics. It speaks to our current time, but it's not only about these times. Right? We understand the problems of racism that we're experiencing today have only been around for the last 500 years. Right? The dominance of white supremacy, dominance of European nations, slave trade, all this has occurred within the last 500 years. Right? We're talking about a culture that is 5,000 years old. So to limit it and see everything through just the last 500 years, right? This is just an episode. This may only be a blip in our larger history. Right. When we move past this moment. So it's not all about this period. And people who only live in the present of their own conditions and circumstances and reduce everything to that don't really become Israelites. They may become black nationalists, they may become Black Panthers, they may become other things, but this way of life, a way of life, encompasses everything. And this is what Rabbi Matthews really taught. Now, of course, he was a nationalist, as I said, they were Garveyites. Their view was that we were the original Israelites.
All right.
Right? And they were making a very important, but I think subtle point. When they said original, right, that if you look at who the original Israelites were, they were black people. They made that argument. They were able to prove that. By saying we are the original, we're not saying we are the only. We're saying we're the original, the first people, right, the first Israelites, right? So we don't necessarily know who all the other Israelites are, because the Torah says that I, Hashem, I will scatter them to the four corners of the earth and the islands of the sea, and I will regather them. So I don't know everywhere the Most High spread them, Israel. He did say I spread them everywhere with the four corners of the earth. So four corners of the earth means four corners. Some people say, well, it doesn't mean that corner. It doesn't mean that corner. It really just means my corner of the earth. And so people, and this just goes on among Europeans. Well, when they say four corners of the earth, it only means Europe. That's only one corner. Doesn't include Africa and Asia, Latin America. And so conversely, we're not saying that other people may not be Israelites. We're speaking for ourselves, who we are. And other people, they could discover, define who they are. But we're talking about who we are. And we don't want to make the same mistake of saying, well, I know who all these people are. But we are the original. That was his point that he made. He had the congregation, commandment keepers. The congregation had a lodge called the Royal Order of Ethiopian Hebrews. Now, lodges, and Rabbi Ford also had a lodge called the Memnon Lodge. Lodges were secret organizations, a lot like the Masons, if you're familiar with Masons and Masonry, right? So, and this is why I said earlier when I started with the secret things belong to the law of God and those things revealed belonging to us, there were certain things they would not teach in the public of the congregation. But within their private lodge, which requires special membership, they have special handshakes, passwords. If you're familiar with other lodges like the Masons, other lodges, that's a membership organization. So there are certain things they would teach from the Bema, and certain things that were more secret they would teach within their lodges. And his lodge was called the Royal Order of the Ethiopian Hebrews, and I talked about why they called themselves Ethiopians at that time. But there were secrets with that. One of the secrets was about these names, and I think this is appropriate as I talk to you today in terms of his teachings and what we thought, and maybe how it relates to some of our theological issues today. In returning, and this, again, all the words were specific in the Hebrew, shuvah, return, not converting. Right? We are returning to who we are, not converting to something else. Those who are returning have to learn certain things, have to learn what has been taken from them, and has to be restored. So they were willing to learn from other people to get back what was ours. Learn from other people to get. Now the Talmud says, ask the question, Mi chacham, who is wise? Who is a wise man? And the answer is, he who can learn from anyone. That is the definition of a wise person. Your ability to learn, right? And if you could learn from a wise teacher, you could derive that. But it says, he who can learn from anyone, meaning you could even learn from a fool. That's right. From a fool, you can learn what not to do. That's right. That's right. From a wise man, you can learn what you should do. Right. Even from a person of limited knowledge and understanding, who may say, I only know one thing, right, but I'm going to tell you that one thing. That's right. And if you could learn that one thing from them, you are a wise person. So you can learn something from everybody. That's right. Right? And they were open and thirsty and hungry for knowledge wherever they could find it and wherever they could get it. And this is our relationship between Israelites and our white European Jewish brothers. Whatever they could get or learn from them, they were willing to get and decide for themselves if it was useful or not, if it helped in their own development or not. So things that they wanted, such as access to the language, access to books. Sometimes they would tell stories about how they would want to give them books, get information, get things like Torah scrolls, get Hebrew Bibles. I mean, you get King James English, but when they started to move into the Hebrew language, where can we get this in America, right? Without going to these sources, going to these places. How has things that the Torah doesn't tell us every detail about what should be done and how it should be done? Those things, these customs, traditions, rituals, some of them had to be learned, and they were willing, as I said, to learn from anyone, but reserve their own independence to decide for themselves if it was appropriate or not. So this is why they didn't become carbon copies of other communities. And Rabbi Matthews, we know, was a man of God, and that where he didn't have precedents to follow, he established or created culture and tradition. He devised ways to make the Torah relevant, even if European Jews weren't doing it. So some of those things, we just had a couple of weeks ago, the festival of Shavuot. Rabbi Matthews is one of the United States who said we should bring out offerings, cakes or bread that should be baked. And many communities are still doing this. When do we start doing this? European Jews don't do this, right? Rabbi Matthews established these. During Sukkot, he determined that we should bring fruit. It says this is the festival of the harvest offering. We should bring fruit offering. And so we would put our fruit into baskets and bring them to the temple. Rabbi Matthews was doing this, teaching this. These are not, you won't find these customs practiced by European Jewish communities. And other things that he did, the anointings and so on and so forth, going to the river on Yom Kippur, these type of things. So he gave us what we thought was a very rich and unique, but also very distinct community. Torah says, be deliberate in judgment, rise up many disciples. Second point. He rose up many disciples. He was a great man, but he died in 1973. So fortunately, before he died, he rose up many disciples. In 1925, he established a school called the Ethiopian Rabbinical College. Again, all of the organizations of that period have the word Ethiopian in them. He established a college called the Ethiopian Rabbinical College. And some of his students are people you might know, and I'll just talk about 4 of those students. One of his early students was Rabbi Yirmiyahu Yisrael. Rabbi Yisrael's mother was a member of Commandment Keepers. So we talk about, we think of him as an older man with a long gray beard, right? His mother was a member of Commandment Keepers. In 1945, Rabbi Yisrael established his first congregation, and here I'm thinking of Kahal. It was called Kahal Beth B'nai Yisrael, and it was in Harlem, and he established with a colleague, another rabbinical colleague, Rabbi McLeod. And they had tension, and eventually he moved his congregation to Brooklyn, where it became B'nai Adath congregation. So he was a student of Rabbi Matthews, and he established B'nai Adath in 1945. Another one of his students was Rabbi Moses, and he established Mount Horeb congregation in the Bronx. My father, Levi ben Levi, was a member of his congregation. He joined the congregation in 1957. He was ordained in 1967, and then he started a congregation called Beth Shalom. Started it in his home, and this is where Sheknel and I, we go back to that home, to that living room, not 730 Willoughby Avenue, but to Astoria. That's where we go back, to an idea. Rabbi Matthews taught that thoughts are a dynamic force through which ideas are formed. And ideas are the embryos of manifestation. Therefore, as Proverbs says, as a man thinketh within himself, so is he. So these were young, all of the people I'm talking about, young, dynamic, inspired leaders who sat there and said, I am going to start a congregation. And it starts as an idea in your head. And it becomes manifest through your actions. So he said, I'm going to start a congregation. It's going to be called Beth Shalom. And he had that idea in that story, which is where he, and in that story, Coin Levy, I'm going to talk about in a moment, were also there. So this is why, like I said, people may not be familiar, but we go way, way back to those days growing up together. My father and Coin Levy were very close. How close? Well, they both lived in Astoria, and they spent many hours and days discussing Torah together. One of the things that always strikes me when I'm blessed to be in the presence of Coin Levy is one of his rings that he wears, which is the sister ring to the ring that I'm wearing, which is a testimony to how close he and my father were. And so they had these brother rings made, custom made for them. And that's why I said the only person I've ever seen it like this, because this is Rabbi Levi, this is Coin Levi on that, is Coin Levi. And so, and my father left that ring to me, and I'm going to leave it to my son. But they were very close at that time. And so, of course, Coin Levi was a member of B'nai Adat at that time, and then starts Hashaba, and then raised up many disciples, many of his students. Amen. Coin Mikael and others. So when I talk about the chain of custody, there's an unbroken line that you could draw of how all these people and teachers and leaders are related from one to another, and how they grow off, and this transmission of knowledge, how it's transformed through there. And so I said, my father joined the congregation in 1957. He graduated in 67. Started Beth Shalom really in his home in Astoria. His first place was 609 Marcy Avenue. Now, a few people go back to Beth Shalom when it was on Marcy Avenue. And more people remember in 1969 when they moved from Marcy Avenue to 730 Willoughby Avenue, where it is now. In 1971, he and his colleagues, and here I'm referring to the late Rabbi YEHUDAH, also with Rabbi Paris, Rabbi Poinsett, Rabbi Yisrael, all students of Rabbi Matthews, they revived their alma mater, the Ethiopian Rabbinical College, and renamed it the Israelite Rabbinical Academy, the Israelite Rabbinical Academy. And that's what it was throughout all the 1970s. And many of the rabbis who came out during that period, Rabbi Yeshurun, Rabbi Camille Levy, Rabbi Betzalel, all of the current generation of black rabbis, Rabbi Baruch and Rabbi Benjamin and Rabbi Yeshurun, the current spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers, Rabbi Zechariah, of all of the current rabbis came out of the Israelite Rabbinical Academy. And you'll notice that this transition, as we move from the term Ethiopian to Israelite, that these leaders were among the first people to use the term Israelite. In terms of when you go and you try to find an organization with the term Israelite in it, how far can you go back, right? To the late 60s, early 70s. And so when they incorporated the Israelite Rabbinical Academy in 1971, and the Israelite Board of Rabbis, as a black board of rabbis, just like you have the New York Board of Rabbis and other board of rabbis, that we were established as an independent community. So people say, are you a rabbi? You're a rabbi. Are you a member of the New York Board of Rabbis? We would say, we have our own board of black rabbis. And it's called the Israelite Board of Rabbis. And they would ask us, where did you get your training? Where did you go to this school, this yeshiva? We have our own school. Right. And it's the Israelite Rabbinical Academy. Or it was the Ethiopian Rabbinical College. So these are the elements of having an independent and self-sufficient community. Exactly. Is that you have your own schools and you have your own institutions and you have your own organizations. That may mirror other organizations and may cooperate with other organizations to teach some of the same things that other institutions teach and things that they don't teach. Right, right. And so this was what made these communities unique. And so most black rabbis, and again, I've just in the interest of time focused here on New York, but the same was happening in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And so this is just kind of a brief summary of the history that brings us together. So although I may be new to some of you, and people who think that our communities are separate or don't have a relationship, there is a long history and bond that particularly those of us who lived it know and cherish. And so when I hear tension sometimes, I usually know that it has to be coming from someone who doesn't know. Because the people who do know this history respect it and appreciate it.